You won't need to know this.
If you're going to San Francisco,
heading west on California, speed approximately 70 miles per hour.
Beams, some sort of reflector.
General, you're under oath as United States Marine! Let me remind you that our lives
I've been in the service. This is good speed.
What if a prison built to hold the world's most dangerous criminals suddenly became a battlefield that could decide the fate of an entire city? Explosions, betrayal, and a mission no one is supposed to survive. This is the world of The Rock, 1996, directed by Michael Bay, produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, and made on a massive Hollywood action scale with intense military realism and non-stop tension. If you enjoy cinematic breakdowns like this, make sure to stay with the story till the end. And if you want more movie explanations, hit like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The story begins with a shocking situation forming in the shadows of American military secrecy. Deep inside the United States government, a group of highly trained Marines under the command of a highly respected but increasingly frustrated General Francis Hummel starts to take action that will shake the entire nation. Hummel is not an ordinary villain. He is a decorated war hero who has served his country for years, but behind his honor lies anger and disappointment. He believes the government has abandoned the families of fallen soldiers, men who died in secret missions that were never officially recognized. As his frustration grows, Hummel gathers his loyal team of elite Marines. These are not inexperienced soldiers. They are professionals who understand warfare better than most people in the system. Together, they carry out a secret operation that no one sees coming. Their target is not just any location, it is Alcatraz Island, famously known as The Rock, a former maximum security prison located in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz has been abandoned for years, turned into a historical site. But Hummel and his men see it differently. For them, it is the perfect fortress. Surrounded by strong ocean currents and heavily isolated, it becomes the ideal place to stage something far more dangerous than anyone can imagine. Under the cover of secrecy, Hummel and his team infiltrate the island using military precision. They eliminate minimal resistance and take control of the entire facility in a short amount of time. But this is not just a takeover, it is the beginning of a national crisis. Once inside, they set up a deadly plan involving stolen chemical weapons. VX gas rockets capable of killing thousands of civilians in San Francisco within minutes. At the same time, Hummel sends a chilling message to the United States government. He does not ask for money or political power. Instead, he demands justice for the forgotten soldiers whose deaths were never acknowledged. His demand is simple but impossible for the government to accept openly, because admitting to secret missions would expose illegal military operations. As news of the Alcatraz takeover spreads, panic begins to build in Washington, D.C. Military leaders, intelligence agencies, and top officials are thrown into chaos. They understand one thing clearly: Hummel is not bluffing. If negotiations fail, San Francisco will be destroyed. To handle the situation, the government realizes they need a very unusual approach. Direct military attack is too risky because Hummel and his men are highly trained and know the island's defenses better than anyone. A full assault would likely result in mass casualties and possibly trigger the release of the chemical weapons. So instead, they consider a secret infiltration mission. At this point, a key figure is introduced: Stanley Goodspeed, a brilliant but nervous FBI chemical weapons expert. Stanley is not a field agent. He is a scientist, someone who understands toxins, not combat, but his knowledge of VX gas makes him essential to the operation. He is pulled into the crisis without preparation, thrown into a world of danger he has never experienced before. Meanwhile, inside a maximum security prison, another man becomes important to the mission: John Mason, a mysterious British prisoner who has been locked away by the government for decades without official charges. Mason is not an ordinary criminal. He is a former British intelligence agent who once infiltrated Alcatraz years ago and escaped, making him the only known person to ever successfully break out of the island alive. The government sees Mason as the only possible guide who understands the hidden tunnels and secrets of Alcatraz, but convincing him to help is another challenge entirely. Mason has no loyalty to the system that imprisoned him for so long, and he is not interested in cooperation. As tensions rise, Stanley Goodspeed is given a direct order: work with Mason and lead a covert team into Alcatraz. Their mission is simple in words but nearly impossible in reality: enter the island undetected, neutralize the chemical threat, and stop Hummel before San Francisco is destroyed. But nothing about this mission is safe, simple, or predictable. As preparations begin, the full scale of danger becomes clear. Hummel's men are not ordinary soldiers. They are prepared for anything. The island is heavily fortified with weapons, explosives, and surveillance. Every step inside Alcatraz could be the last. And yet, despite all warnings, the mission moves forward. A small team is assembled, combining elite Navy SEALs with Stanley Goodspeed and the reluctant John Mason. Each member carries a different role, but none of them can fully predict what awaits inside the island fortress. As helicopters prepare for insertion under the cover of night, a final silence falls over the operation. The ocean waves crash against the rocks of Alcatraz, and the dark silhouette of the prison looms like a forgotten nightmare waiting to wake up. No one speaks much. The weight of the mission is clear. This is not just a rescue operation. It is a race against time where failure means the death of an entire city. The helicopters begin to move toward the island, cutting through the fog as they approach the most dangerous entry point in the United States. And as they cross the final distance toward Alcatraz, the mission officially begins. As the helicopters cut through the thick fog hovering over San Francisco Bay, the tension inside the aircraft is already unbearable. The sound of spinning rotors mixes with the nervous breathing of the men inside. Below them, the dark silhouette of Alcatraz Island slowly becomes clearer. An abandoned prison that once held the most dangerous criminals in America, now transformed into a heavily armed fortress controlled by rogue Marines. Every second brings them closer to a mission where survival is uncertain and failure is not an option. Inside one of the helicopters, Stanley Goodspeed sits stiffly, gripping his gear with shaky hands. He is a chemical weapons expert, not a soldier, and everything about this moment feels wrong to him. His mind keeps running through worst-case scenarios: VX gas exposure, structural traps, crossfire situations, but none of his scientific knowledge can prepare him for real combat. Beside him sits John Mason, calm, silent, and observant. Unlike Stanley, Mason shows no fear, only quiet calculation. His eyes study the island like a map he already knows. The Navy SEAL team leader gives the final briefing over the radio. The mission is divided into insertion points. The SEALs will enter first, secure key positions, and establish control zones. Stanley and Mason will follow behind under protection. The goal is simple in words: infiltrate, locate the chemical rockets, and neutralize the threat. But everyone in the helicopter knows the reality is far more complicated. As they approach the island, the fog thickens, swallowing visibility. The pilots rely on instruments alone. Suddenly, Alcatraz appears beneath them like a ghost rising from the water, cold, isolated, and heavily fortified. Searchlights sweep across the surface, revealing armed men patrolling the perimeter. The takeover is real, and Hummel's forces are fully prepared. Without warning, the first helicopters begin their descent. The SEAL teams fast rope onto the rooftop of the prison. One after another, they drop into darkness, weapons ready, moving with perfect coordination. The sound of boots hitting concrete is followed by immediate silence as they take cover. For a moment, everything seems smooth. No alarms, no gunfire, just precision. But that silence does not last. Inside Alcatraz, General Homel watches surveillance feeds calmly. He is not surprised. He expected a response. His voice is steady as he orders his men to hold position. Unlike ordinary terrorists, Hummel does not panic. He is a strategist, and every move he makes is calculated. The SEALs begin advancing through corridors, clearing rooms with precision. Night vision goggles glow faint green in the darkness. The prison, once filled with inmates, now feels like a maze of death waiting to trap intruders. Walls echo with distant footsteps, but no one is visible. The tension grows with every step. Stanley Goodspeed and John Mason are lowered onto the island separately, escorted by SEALs. The landing is rough, and Stanley immediately struggles to maintain balance. Mason, however, lands smoothly and quickly surveys the environment. He immediately notices structural details: old tunnels, guard pathways, and blind spots. Without saying much, he begins walking ahead as if instinctively remembering the layout of the prison. Stanley follows nervously. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he asks. Mason replies calmly, "I've been everywhere in this prison, except death." That response sends a chill through Stanley, but there is no time to think further. The mission is already moving forward. Suddenly, a distant explosion shakes the ground. One of the SEAL teams has triggered a defensive trap. The silence of Alcatraz is broken as gunfire erupts across the upper levels. Bright flashes light up the corridors. Hummel's men respond with military precision, using the prison structure as cover. The SEALs are no longer the hunters, they are inside enemy territory. Communication lines crackle with panic. Reports come in. Teams are pinned down, visibility compromised, casualties unknown. The operation is already deteriorating faster than expected. Inside the chaos, Stanley and Mason are forced to move independently with limited protection. Their escort team pushes forward through narrow corridors that lead deeper into the prison's lower levels. The air grows colder. The sound of dripping water echoes through empty cells that once held dangerous criminals. Mason suddenly stops at a wall, placing his hand on it. "This section wasn't here when I escaped," he mutters. That single statement reveals something critical. Alcatraz has been modified. Hummel's men have changed the internal structure, adding new pathways and blocking old ones. The mission just became even more unpredictable. Meanwhile, Hummel receives updates from his men. The SEALs are stronger than expected, but they are still contained. Hummel's goal is not total destruction yet. He is testing the government's response, waiting to see how far they will go before negotiating. But outside the island, the pressure is increasing. The US government realizes the situation is escalating faster than predicted. If Hummel activates even one VX rocket, thousands of civilians in San Francisco will die within seconds. There is no room for delay. Back inside Alcatraz, Stanley and Mason finally reach a lower access tunnel. The entrance is dark, barely lit by emergency lights flickering overhead. Mason takes point without hesitation, while Stanley follows reluctantly. Every sound feels amplified in the narrow space: their footsteps, their breathing, even the distant echoes of gunfire above. Then suddenly they hear something worse. A mechanical sound. Slow, heavy, dangerous. Stanley freezes. "What is that?" he whispers. Mason doesn't answer immediately. His eyes narrow as he listens carefully. Then he speaks in a low voice. "That's not part of the prison." And just as they step forward into the darkness, the reality becomes clear. They are not just entering a prison anymore. They are walking deeper into a war zone designed to never let them leave. And inside that darkness, the true danger of Alcatraz is only just beginning to reveal itself. The dark tunnel inside Alcatraz feels like a living trap. Every step echoes louder than it should, as if the prison itself is listening. Stanley Goodspeed's heartbeat is now louder in his ears than the distant gunfire above. The mechanical sound they heard moments ago still lingers in the air, heavy and unsettling, like something massive moving through the structure. John Mason walks ahead without hesitation, his movements controlled and precise. Unlike Stanley, he does not react emotionally. He observes, he calculates. Every corner of this prison is familiar to him in some way, even though he knows it has been modified since his escape years ago. Suddenly, Mason stops again. He crouches slightly, examining faint markings on the wall, fresh weld points, reinforced steel plating, and newly added access panels. His expression tightens. "They've rebuilt parts of the lower system," he says quietly. Stanley looks confused. "Why would they rebuild a prison that's not even in use?" Mason answers without turning back. "Because they didn't rebuild it for prisoners." That single line changes the entire atmosphere. Stanley realizes this is no longer just a hostage situation on the surface. Something deeper, more dangerous has been prepared inside this island. Above them, the battle continues to escalate. The Navy SEAL teams are still engaging Hummel's forces in controlled firefights, but the advantage is slowly shifting. Hummel's men know every corner of Alcatraz. They use hidden positions, narrow corridors, and elevated firing points to neutralize the attackers. The SEALs are skilled, but they are outsiders in a battlefield designed by their enemy. Inside the command center of the island, General Hummel remains calm. His voice is steady as he gives orders to his men. There is no chaos in his thinking, only structure. He is not trying to massacre indiscriminately. He is controlling pressure, waiting for the government to respond to his demands. Meanwhile, deep below the prison, Stanley and Mason continue moving through the tunnel system. The air becomes heavier, colder. The lighting shifts from dim to nearly non-existent. Stanley's flashlight becomes their only guide, cutting through darkness that seems endless. Then suddenly they hear voices. Not distant gunfire, not explosions. Voices. Human voices. Stanley freezes instantly. "Are they close?" Mason raises a hand, signaling silence. He listens carefully. The voices are organized, calm, and disciplined. These are not prisoners. These are trained soldiers. Mason slowly moves forward, peeking around a corner. What he sees confirms his suspicion. Armed men stationed at key junction points, guarding access routes that lead deeper into the island's core. He pulls back immediately. The deeper Stanley Goodspeed and John Mason move into Alcatraz, the more the prison feels less like a man-made structure and more like a controlled ecosystem of danger. The walls are colder here, almost damp with age and pressure. Every sound travels differently, softer but sharper, as if the island is absorbing noise and releasing it in distorted echoes. Stanley tries to keep his breathing steady, but it's becoming harder. The idea that armed men might be tracking them through the same tunnels is no longer theoretical. It feels immediate. Every flicker of light, every distant metallic echo now carries weight. Mason, however, remains steady. He moves like someone who has already accepted all possible outcomes. There is no panic in him, only awareness. And that calmness is what keeps Stanley moving forward. Above them, the situation on the surface has fully collapsed into controlled chaos. The Navy SEAL teams that were once executing a precise infiltration are now scattered across Alcatraz's upper levels. What was supposed to be a surgical strike has turned into a layered urban war inside a fortress. Hummel's men are not behaving like desperate terrorists. They are acting like disciplined soldiers defending a strategic position. One SEAL unit attempts to breach a control corridor, only to be met with coordinated crossfire from elevated positions. Another unit tries to flank through a service hallway, but is forced back by carefully placed explosives. The island itself feels like it is fighting back. Inside one of the SEAL communication channels, fragmented reports come through, some clear, others cut off mid-transmission. The command structure is breaking down under pressure. Back in Washington, the political situation is becoming even more unstable. Officials realize that if Alcatraz falls further into Hummel's control, the VX rockets could be launched at any moment. There is no room for delay anymore. But inside the island, General Hummel remains calm. He stands in his command area, surrounded by monitors displaying different sections of Alcatraz. Each feed shows movement, resistance, and containment zones. He is not reacting emotionally to the violence unfolding around him. Instead, he is measuring it. A subordinate approaches him. Sir, they've breached the lower access levels. Hummel nods slightly. Good, let them come deeper. There is no fear in his voice, only certainty. Meanwhile, deep underground, Stanley and Mason finally reach a section where the tunnel system begins to widen. The narrow, claustrophobic corridors open into a larger industrial space. Old maintenance structures, reinforced steel beams, and upgraded mechanical systems line the area. Stanley shines his flashlight across the room slowly. This doesn't look like a prison anymore, he says quietly. Mason replies without hesitation, because it isn't one. As they step forward, Stanley notices something disturbing. Fresh ventilation systems, reinforced gas containment units, and electrical wiring that clearly did not exist in the original Alcatraz structure. This area has been heavily modified for one purpose: sustained chemical weapon storage. Stanley's voice tightens. This is VX infrastructure. Mason looks at him briefly. You understand it better than I do. Stanley swallows hard. If even one of those rockets is triggered inside this system, he doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. A sudden distant vibration interrupts them. It is not footsteps this time. It is mechanical, heavy, systematic. Something large is moving through the infrastructure ahead. Mason raises his hand again, signaling silence. They both freeze. The sound grows louder for a few seconds, then stops. Stanley whispers, "What was that?" Mason studies the ceiling above them. "Transport system." Stanley frowns. "Transport for what?" Mason doesn't answer immediately. His expression tightens slightly as pieces of the puzzle align. Then he says quietly, "For the rockets." A heavy silence follows. At that moment, the full reality begins to settle in. The VX rockets are not just stored somewhere, they are integrated into the island's modified structure, likely moved through internal systems designed specifically for rapid deployment. This means Hummel's plan is more advanced than anyone anticipated. Above ground, another shift occurs. The government has authorized limited escalation. Additional military pressure is being prepared, but there is still hesitation, because any wrong move could trigger the chemical release. Inside the SEAL units, leadership tries to regroup surviving teams. Communication is unstable, but one message is clear: the mission is no longer about suppression. It is about preventing mass destruction at all costs. Back underground, Stanley and Mason continue forward, now more carefully than ever. Every step feels like they are walking closer to the center of something that was never meant to be discovered. The corridor ahead begins to slope downward slightly. The air grows denser. The lighting shifts from industrial dimness to intermittent red emergency strips along the walls. Stanley notices something else, faint chemical warning labels marked along storage doors. His stomach tightens. We're getting close, he says. Mason nods once. Yes. They reach a large reinforced door at the end of the corridor. It is not a standard prison gate. It is industrial grade, sealed with multiple locking mechanisms and electronic systems layered for maximum security. Stanley stares at it. This is it. Mason steps closer, examining the structure. Not just a door. He pauses. A threshold. Stanley looks at him. A threshold to what? Mason does not answer immediately. Instead, he listens. From behind the door, a faint mechanical hum can be heard, low, rhythmic, and controlled. Then another sound joins it, a distant hydraulic movement. Stanley's eyes widen slightly. They're inside. Mason places his hand on the door carefully, feeling the vibration through the metal. Or they're about to be activated, he says quietly. A tense silence fills the corridor, and for the first time since entering Alcatraz, Stanley realizes something terrifying. They are no longer trying to find the threat. They are standing directly in front of it. Stanley Goodspeed and John Mason stand in front of the massive reinforced industrial door deep inside Alcatraz, unaware that what lies beyond it will redefine the entire scale of the crisis unfolding above them. The air in the corridor is heavy and stale, carrying a faint chemical undertone that Stanley's trained mind immediately tries to categorize, but nothing about it matches anything safe or familiar. The door itself is unlike anything seen in a standard prison environment. It is layered with military-grade steel, hydraulic locking mechanisms, and encrypted electronic access systems that suggest not just security, but containment of something that was never meant to be accessed under normal circumstances. Stanley's fingers move carefully across the control panel, his scientific instinct fighting against rising fear as he attempts to bypass the system. Every failed attempt makes the machine respond with subtle mechanical resistance as if the structure itself is evaluating him. Mason stands slightly behind, silent and alert, scanning the surrounding walls and ceiling as though expecting movement from within the structure itself. He is not surprised by the complexity of the system. Instead, he seems to recognize the logic behind it in fragments, as if his past experiences are slowly aligning with the reality of what this facility has become. Behind the door, a low mechanical hum continues to grow more structured and rhythmic. It is not random noise, but a controlled operational sound like machinery running on synchronized cycles. Stanley pauses for a moment, his hand hovering over the controls as he listens more carefully. His expression changes subtly as his scientific mind begins to break down what he is hearing. This is not ventilation, it is not standard electrical equipment. It is something designed for sustained industrial level activation. Mason notices Stanley's reaction and steps closer, placing his hand briefly against the cold metal surface of the door. He feels the vibration travel through it, steady and deliberate, confirming what his instincts already suspect. The system behind the door is active, not dormant. Stanley finally speaks in a low, tense voice, trying to rationalize what they are dealing with, but even his explanation sounds uncertain. The idea that they are standing in front of a live chemical weapons deployment system begins to take shape in his mind, but he refuses to fully accept it until he sees proof. Above them, Alcatraz continues to deteriorate into layered chaos. The Navy SEAL teams that were inserted with precision are now scattered across multiple levels of the island, engaged in fragmented firefights that are no longer controlled or predictable. What was originally a tactical infiltration has transformed into survival inside enemy territory that was engineered specifically for defensive warfare. Hommel's men are not reacting like desperate insurgents. They are executing coordinated defensive strategies that use the prison's architecture as a weapon itself. Narrow corridors become choke points, elevated walkways turn into firing zones, and sealed doors become traps that isolate and eliminate advancing units. Communication between SEAL teams is breaking down under pressure, and command structure is becoming increasingly fragmented as casualties rise and situational awareness collapses. In Washington, the political and military leadership is now fully aware that time is running out. Every failed attempt to regain control of the island increases the risk that Homo will escalate to chemical deployment, turning a hostage situation into a mass casualty event within minutes. Inside the command center, General Francis Hummel remains the only figure who appears unaffected by the escalating violence. He observes the battlefield through multiple surveillance feeds, each screen showing different layers of conflict across Alcatraz. His posture is steady, his voice controlled, and his decisions calculated. He is not acting out of emotional instability, but out of a rigid belief system shaped by years of military service and betrayal. For him, the operation is not about destruction, but about forcing recognition for soldiers who were sacrificed and forgotten by the system they served. However, beneath his composed exterior lies an irreversible truth. The VX rockets are real, and if control is lost or negotiations fail, he is fully prepared to activate them. His strategy is built on pressure, but pressure can collapse into catastrophe if mismanaged. Back underground, Stanley finally manages to override part of the locking mechanism. A small indicator light changes status, and the system responds with a deep mechanical click that echoes through the corridor like a warning rather than a success. Stanley immediately realizes that the system has not been fully disarmed. It has simply acknowledged input. Mason steps back slightly, listening again to the sound behind the door, which has now shifted into a more intense operational rhythm. It feels like something is transitioning into a new phase of activity. Stanley's breathing becomes heavier as he processes the possibility that they may not be unlocking a storage room but triggering access to an active deployment chamber. Before he can fully process this thought, a sudden vibration travels through the floor, stronger than anything before it, followed by a distant mechanical shift deeper within the structure. Mason reacts instantly, pulling Stanley back from the door as the system behind it begins to disengage from within. The door slowly starts to open on its own, releasing pressure in controlled stages rather than a single mechanical release. A thin strip of cold artificial light leaks through the gap, illuminating dust particles in the air like suspended fragments of time. Stanley stares at it, frozen between curiosity and fear, while Mason maintains focus, his expression tightening as he anticipates what is about to be revealed. As the opening widens, the interior space becomes partially visible, and the scale of what lies beyond immediately redefines everything they thought they understood about the mission. Massive industrial structures line the interior chamber. including cylindrical containment systems, reinforced loading arms, transport rails, and synchronized mechanical platforms designed. Stanley Goodspeed and John Mason stand motionless at the edge of the massive underground VX deployment chamber, staring at a reality that feels too large to fully process. The moment the industrial door finishes opening, the full scale of Alcatraz's transformation is revealed, and it is far beyond anything Stanley had ever prepared for in his career as a chemical weapons expert. The chamber stretches deep into the island's core, lined with reinforced steel frameworks, hydraulic loading arms, and precision transport rails that converge toward a central platform designed for coordinated missile handling. Everything is structured, organized, and engineered with a level of military sophistication that suggests years of preparation. This is not a rushed terrorist operation. It is a fully developed weapons deployment system embedded into the island itself. Stanley's voice comes out low and unstable as he tries to categorize what he is seeing, but his scientific logic struggles against the scale of the design. The VX rockets are not just stored here as isolated threats, they are integrated into a synchronized system capable of movement, alignment, and potential launch coordination. He begins to understand that the entire structure of Alcatraz has been re-engineered into a hybrid military facility, combining prison architecture with modern weapons deployment infrastructure. Mason remains silent, scanning the chamber with calm precision, but his expression tightens as he recognizes patterns that only someone with operational experience would notice. The layout is not defensive, it is strategic. Every pathway, every rail, every elevated platform has a purpose. Above ground, the island continues to burn with controlled chaos. The Navy SEAL teams are now deeply fragmented across multiple sectors of Alcatraz. Communication is unreliable, and coordination is breaking down as the teams encounter increasingly structured resistance from Hummel's forces. What was once a covert infiltration has turned into a layered urban battlefield inside a fortified prison. Hummel's men are not acting randomly, they are guiding movement, forcing SEAL units into predetermined kill zones and using the island's architecture as a tactical weapon. Stairwells become ambush points, corridors become containment funnels, and sealed gates isolate advancing units from support. The operation is no longer about control, it is about survival inside an environment designed for domination. Inside his command center, General Francis Hummel continues to monitor the situation with disciplined focus. Despite the escalating violence, his demeanor remains steady, almost detached. He watches multiple surveillance feeds simultaneously, tracking SEAL movements, internal positions, and defensive outcomes with calculated precision. For Hummel, this is not chaos, it is leverage. Every confrontation, every delay, every escalation increases pressure on the government to respond to his demands. His objective is not immediate destruction but forced acknowledgement. However, the presence of VX rockets means the situation carries an irreversible threshold. If control is lost or if negotiation fails, the system he has built will transition from pressure to annihilation without hesitation. Back underground, Stanley moves slowly into the chamber, stepping past the threshold of the door with Mason close behind. The air inside is colder and carries a faint chemical residue that Stanley's trained senses immediately recognize as dangerous, even in trace amounts. The lighting system is dim but functional, casting long shadows across massive industrial equipment that fills the chamber like a mechanical skeleton. As they move deeper, Stanley notices synchronized mechanical activity, transport arms shifting slightly, calibration systems adjusting, and loading platforms aligning into position. The system is active, not dormant. Operational cycles are running. Stanley's mind races as he realizes that the VX rockets are not simply being stored, they are being prepared for potential deployment. He begins to connect the structural elements. The rails are not for storage, they are for movement. The platforms are not static, they are dynamic alignment systems. The chamber is not a warehouse, it is a launch preparation facility. Mason stops briefly near one of the structural columns, listening carefully. The rhythmic mechanical hum is now more pronounced, layered with hydraulic pressure shifts and distant automated movements. He recognizes something familiar in the pattern, a system designed for controlled activation under command authorization. That realization shifts the entire meaning of their presence here. They are not inside a hidden room. They are inside a functioning weapon system that is already in motion. Stanley turns toward Mason, his voice strained. He tries to explain the implications, but even as he speaks, he realizes how catastrophic the situation is. If even one VX rocket is armed and deployed, the chemical fallout could spread across San Francisco in minutes, resulting in mass casualties that no emergency response could contain. The system is not just dangerous, it is irreversible once activated. Mason listens without interruption, absorbing the tactical reality rather than the scientific one. For him, the key question is not what the system is, but how it can be stopped. At that moment, a deeper mechanical shift echoes through the chamber. The entire structure vibrates subtly, indicating that something within the system has changed state. Stanley freezes as he realizes that the operational cycle has advanced. The loading systems begin to reposition, and transport rails activate in synchronized motion, suggesting that internal sequencing has begun without manual input from their location. Mason immediately reacts, pulling Stanley back behind a structural column as the chamber's activity increases. It is no longer passive, it is transitioning toward readiness. Above them, the seal operation reaches another critical collapse point. A full unit is cut off inside a sealed corridor, with no extraction route available. Another team is forced into retreat after encountering heavily fortified defensive positions that block all forward movement. Hummel's forces maintain strategic dominance across multiple levels of the island, controlling the battlefield with precision rather than chaos. In Washington, pressure intensifies as leaders realize that military intervention is losing effectiveness and that time is rapidly running out before chemical deployment becomes a real possibility. Inside the chamber, Stanley watches as the VX system continues its activation cycle. His understanding becomes clearer with each passing second. This is not a storage site waiting for command. It is a pre-configured system designed to respond instantly once activation thresholds are met. Mason looks toward the deeper end of the chamber, where additional structural layers extend beyond visibility. His instincts tell him that the core of the system lies further inside, possibly containing the actual launch control interface or coordination node. Stanley finally speaks again, quieter now, almost resigned. He understands that they are standing inside the most dangerous point of the entire operation. Every structural element around them is connected to a system capable of erasing an entire city. And somewhere above them, the battle for control of Alcatraz continues, but it no longer feels like the main conflict. Because the real threat is not the soldiers fighting on the surface, it is the system beneath their feet, and it is waking up. Inside the massive underground VX chamber, the situation is no longer just dangerous, it is active. Stanley Goodspeed and John Mason remain hidden behind a reinforced structural column as the entire facility continues its slow, mechanical awakening. The rhythmic hum that once felt distant is now layered with multiple systems engaging at once. Hydraulic arms shifting, transport rays locking into position, and calibration units adjusting alignment with precise calculated movements. The chamber feels less like a room and more like a living machine responding to an unseen command sequence. Stanley watches in growing horror as he realizes the system is not waiting for human confirmation anymore. It is operating on an internal trigger cycle, an automated readiness protocol designed to prepare VX rockets for deployment without requiring direct manual control at every stage. His scientific mind struggles to keep up with the implications. If this system completes its cycle, it will not just be a threat, it will become an immediate launch-capable platform. Mason remains still, scanning the chamber with sharp focus. His attention is not on the machines themselves, but on the structure of the environment. He studies entry points, elevated platforms, and hidden pathways embedded within the facility design. For him, this is not just a weapon system, it is a battlefield layout. And more importantly, it is a controlled environment that can still be disrupted if the central node is identified. Above them, Alcatraz continues to fracture under sustained combat pressure. The Navy SEAL teams are now operating in isolated fragments across multiple levels of the island. Communication is sporadic, and command coordination has effectively broken down. What was once a precision insertion has become a survival scenario inside a heavily fortified structure designed for defensive dominance. Hommel's men continue to maintain tactical control, using the prison's architecture to guide enemy movement into controlled engagement zones. Every corridor, stairwell, and access point has become part of a larger defensive strategy that anticipates every SEAL advance before it happens. Inside one of the remaining SEAL command channels, fragmented reports suggest that multiple units have either gone silent or been forced into containment positions. Attempts to regroup are failing due to structural isolation and heavy resistance. The operation is no longer about controlling Alcatraz. It is about preventing total collapse while trying to locate the chemical threat before it becomes active. Back inside the command center, General Francis Hummel remains composed, observing the unfolding situation with disciplined detachment. His strategy is still intact: maintain pressure, control escalation, and force the government into recognition. However, even within his structured mindset, there is awareness that the situation is approaching its final threshold. The VX system is no longer just leverage, it is becoming a timer. Once activation reaches completion, control will shift from negotiation to irreversible consequence. Deep underground, Stanley steps slightly forward from the column, trying to get a clearer view of the chamber. What he sees confirms his worst fears. Multiple VX rocket units are arranged in structured positions along reinforced platforms. Each unit is connected to automated handling systems designed to transport, align, and prepare them for launch sequencing. The infrastructure suggests not just readiness, but scalability. This system is capable of managing multiple deployments in rapid succession if activated. Stanley's voice is barely steady when he speaks. He begins explaining the technical reality to Mason in fragmented terms: chemical dispersion risk, atmospheric contamination, and irreversible civilian exposure. But even as he speaks, he realizes that none of the scientific terminology fully captures the scale of what this system represents. This is not a laboratory scenario, it is an engineered catastrophe mechanism embedded into a national landmark. Mason listens carefully, absorbing the information without interruption. His response is not scientific, it is operational. He understands only one critical fact: if the system reaches full readiness and receives activation input, stopping it afterward may not be possible. His focus shifts toward identifying structural vulnerabilities within the chamber. He scans for access corridors leading deeper into the facility, possibly toward the central control node that governs the entire system. Suddenly, a new mechanical shift echoes through the chamber. This one is different from the previous movements. It is deeper, heavier, and more synchronized across multiple systems at once. The entire structure seems to respond as if entering a final preparation stage. Stanley immediately notices the change and freezes. The loading platforms begin locking into fixed positions. Transport rails complete alignment sequences. Indicator lights across the chamber shift from calibration status to readiness confirmation. Stanley's realization hits with full force. The system is transitioning from preparation to active deployment capability. Mason reacts instantly, pulling Stanley further back into cover as a distant mechanical lock engages somewhere deeper within the structure. The sound echoes through the chamber like a final seal being placed on a process that cannot be reversed once completed. Stanley's breathing becomes faster as he processes the timeline. They are no longer dealing with a potential threat. They are inside a system that is actively moving toward operational readiness. Above ground, the SEAL teams attempt another coordinated push into a key structural sector of Alcatraz. However, they are met with heavily reinforced resistance. Hummel's men are now fully operating in defensive synchronization, responding to movements with precision rather than reaction. The island's layout continues to work in their favor, compressing SEAL units into predictable pathways and limiting tactical flexibility. The operation is now at critical instability, with casualties increasing and extraction options diminishing. Inside Washington, the urgency reaches its peak. Decision makers now fully understand that any delay could result in irreversible chemical deployment. However, direct military escalation remains risky due to the probability of triggering the VX system prematurely. The situation is locked in a dangerous equilibrium. Too much force could activate the threat, but too little allows Hummel to maintain control. Back underground, Stanley and Mason begin moving cautiously along the edge of the chamber, trying to locate a potential access route deeper into the system. Mason identifies a narrow maintenance corridor partially hidden behind structural reinforcement beams. It is not part of the main design. It appears to be an auxiliary access path, likely used for internal maintenance or system oversight. Stanley hesitates. The direction leads deeper into the unknown core of the facility, but staying in place is no longer an option. The system around them is advancing too quickly. Mason signals forward movement without waiting for agreement. The decision is already made. As they step toward the corridor, the chamber behind them continues its full activation sequence. Mechanical systems lock into final positions. VX rocket units stabilize on their platforms. The entire structure feels like it is preparing for authorization. And somewhere within the island, beyond their current reach, lies the control mechanism that will determine whether this system remains dormant or becomes the trigger for mass destruction. Stanley looks back once at the chamber, then forward into the narrow corridor. And for the first time, he understands clearly. They are not just trying to stop a weapon anymore. They are racing against a system that is already learning how to fire. Stanley Goodspeed and John Mason move cautiously into the narrow maintenance corridor hidden behind the massive VX chamber, leaving behind the overwhelming sight of the active deployment systems. The moment they step away from the main chamber, the sound changes completely. The heavy mechanical hum fades slightly, replaced by tighter, more confined echoes of distant machinery and the occasional metallic groan of the structure adjusting itself under pressure. The corridor is darker, narrower, and clearly not intended for regular movement, only maintenance or internal access. Stanley's breathing is still uneven. His mind keeps replaying what they just saw. Multiple VX rocket units integrated into a synchronized launch preparation system. Even though he is trying to focus on the present, the scale of what is happening refuses to leave his thoughts. Mason, however, remains grounded. He studies the corridor walls, noting structural patterns, reinforcement seams, and possible branching routes. To him, this is no longer just infiltration. It is navigation through an engineered system designed with purpose. As they move forward, the corridor begins to slope slightly upward, then turn sharply to the right. The walls are lined with old industrial markings layered over newer modifications, indicating that Alcatraz has been repeatedly redesigned over time. Stanley notices something unsettling. Parts of the original prison infrastructure still exist beneath the newer military-grade additions, almost like the island has been rebuilt in layers without ever being fully dismantled. That realization makes the entire structure feel unstable, as if multiple systems are competing for control over the same physical space. Above ground, the situation continues to deteriorate rapidly. The Navy SEAL teams are now operating in scattered fragments, with communication breaking down under pressure. Several units are pinned down in confined areas of Alcatraz, unable to advance or retreat due to coordinated resistance from Hummel's men. What was once a structured infiltration has fully transformed into a containment struggle inside enemy-controlled terrain. The prison's architecture continues to favor Hummel's forces, allowing them to control sightlines, funnel movement, and isolate advancing units into vulnerable positions. Inside the command center, General Francis Hummel remains composed, but the tension in his control room is increasing. Surveillance feeds show escalating resistance and growing instability across multiple sectors. He understands that the situation is approaching its critical threshold. His plan was never designed for indefinite standoff. It was meant to force recognition quickly before escalation reached uncontrollable levels. Now, the VX system below the island adds a dangerous variable that even he cannot fully ignore. The longer the conflict continues, the higher the risk that control over the weapon system could shift away from negotiation entirely. Back underground, Stanley and Mason reach a junction where the corridor splits into multiple directions. One path appears to lead deeper into industrial systems, while another slopes upward toward what could be upper maintenance access points. Mason pauses, carefully analyzing the structural layout. He recognizes subtle indicators in the architecture: load-bearing alignment, ventilation flow direction, and reinforcement density that suggest the most critical systems are located deeper within the island rather than above them. Stanley, still processing the Weeks chamber, tries to focus on the immediate objective. He asks Mason how they are supposed to stop something that is already in motion. Mason does not give a direct answer. Instead, he explains in simple terms that systems like this always depend on a central control point. No matter how advanced the automation is, there is always a core mechanism that governs activation. If that core can be located and disrupted, the entire structure loses coordination. As they continue through the maintenance path, faint vibrations begin to travel through the walls again. This time they are not random mechanical shifts but synchronized pulses, suggesting that the VX system is progressing further into its activation cycle. Stanley immediately recognizes the pattern as escalation. The system is not just preparing, it is advancing through operational stages. Suddenly, a distant sound echoes through the corridor. Metallic footsteps, slow and deliberate. Both men immediately stop moving. Mason signals silence, pressing himself closer to the wall. Stanley's instincts trigger panic, but he forces himself to remain still. The footsteps continue for a few seconds, then pause somewhere further down the corridor network. Mason carefully moves forward, just enough to look around the corner. What he sees confirms their concern. Armed personnel are now patrolling the internal maintenance systems. These are not frontline defenders from the surface battles. They are internal security units assigned to protect deeper infrastructure. This means Hummel's control extends even into the hidden layers of the island. Mason pulls back and whispers that they are being tracked more closely than before. Stanley immediately understands the implication. The deeper they go, the more secure the systems become, and the higher the resistance they will face. The mission is no longer about reaching the VX chamber. It is about surviving long enough to reach the central control point that governs it. They begin moving again, but slower and more calculated. Every step is measured. The corridor narrows further, forcing them into single file movement. The air becomes heavier, slightly metallic, hinting at proximity to active systems or reinforced containment areas. Stanley notices faint markings on the walls, technical symbols, coded identifiers, and directional indicators that suggest internal routing for system maintenance teams. Then another shift occurs. The entire structure vibrates more strongly than before, and the sound of synchronized machinery increases in intensity. Stanley stops and places his hand against the wall. The vibration is no longer uniform. It is layered, meaning multiple systems are now operating simultaneously at different stages. He realizes that the VX system is not just preparing, it is actively transitioning between phases of readiness. Mason looks at him and asks what it means. Stanley explains that this level of activation usually precedes final deployment readiness. Once the system reaches that stage, stopping it becomes significantly more complex, as multiple subsystems will already be locked into operational synchronization. Mason processes this without panic, only adjusting his focus further toward identifying the control node. Above them, the SEAL operation reaches another critical point. A partial regroup attempt is made to stabilize remaining units, but resistance continues to escalate. Hummel's forces maintain structured defensive control, forcing SEAL teams into increasingly constrained movement patterns. The island's layout continues to function as a tactical advantage, reinforcing Hummel's ability to control engagement flow even under external military pressure. Inside Washington, decision makers are now facing extreme urgency. The risk of VX deployment is no longer theoretical, it is a functioning system in active progression. However, direct intervention remains limited due to the danger of triggering immediate release. The entire situation is now balanced on a narrow threshold between containment and catastrophe. Back underground, Stanley and Mason finally reach another structural junction that appears more advanced than previous sections. The walls are reinforced with thicker steel, and the lighting system shifts to a more controlled industrial configuration. This area feels closer to a central operational zone. Mason stops and studies the structure carefully, then signals that they are approaching something important. Stanley looks ahead, tension rising again in his voice. Whatever lies beyond this point is no longer just part of the system. It is likely the control infrastructure itself, the place where activation decisions are made or enforced. And as they prepare to move forward, once again, both men understand the same truth without needing to say it aloud. They are no longer chasing the threat. They are approaching the point where the threat is decided. Stanley Goodspeed and John Mason move deeper into the reinforced core section of Alcatraz, where the maintenance corridors begin to feel less like passageways and more like arteries feeding a larger mechanical system. The walls are thicker here, layered with industrial steel plating and updated control wiring that runs in structured patterns along the ceiling and floor. Every step forward feels like entering a more restricted layer of the island, where access is controlled not just physically but systemically. Stanley notices that the temperature has dropped slightly, and the air carries a sharper metallic scent, suggesting proximity to high-energy operational systems or chemical containment units. Mason leads without hesitation, but his focus is more intense now. He is no longer simply navigating, he is anticipating structure. He studies junction points, ventilation cycles, and reinforcement breaks in the architecture. To him, this is a controlled environment built around a central objective. The deeper they go, the more predictable the design becomes. That predictability is what concerns him most, because systems built with precision usually have one critical dependency point, and if that point is secured, everything else becomes irrelevant. Stanley, on the other hand, is still processing the scale of what they discovered in the VX chamber. Even though they have physically moved away from it, the mental weight of that system remains constant. He keeps thinking about the synchronized loading platforms, the transport rails, and the automated alignment systems. It is not just a weapon, it is an ecosystem designed for chemical deployment. And worse, it is already active. Above ground, the situation across Alcatraz continues to collapse into fragmented control zones. The Navy SEAL teams are now operating under extreme pressure, with communication lines degraded and coordination severely limited. Several units have been isolated in structurally compromised areas of the prison, unable to advance due to coordinated resistance. Hummel's forces continue to use the prison's architecture strategically, forcing engagement patterns that minimize their own exposure while maximizing SEAL vulnerability. The island itself has become an extension of their defensive strategy, turning every corridor into a calculated zone of control. Inside the command center, General Francis Hummel remains steady, though the situation is clearly reaching its most sensitive phase. He observes multiple live feeds showing escalating conflict across the island. His posture remains controlled, but there is an underlying awareness that the VX system introduces a level of risk that goes beyond tactical planning. His objective was to create pressure for negotiation, but now that pressure is approaching a point where it could collapse into irreversible consequence. Even Hummel understands that once chemical activation begins, control is no longer negotiable. Back underground, Stanley and Mason reach a heavily reinforced junction that feels different from the previous sections. The structure here is denser, the lighting more stable, and the airflow more controlled. Stanley immediately recognizes that they are approaching a central operational zone. The design shifts from maintenance-oriented corridors to structured access pathways that likely lead to core control infrastructure. Mason pauses, scanning the environment carefully. He notices subtle indicators in the architecture: signal routing lines, reinforced junction panels, and directional load distribution, all pointing toward a central system hub deeper within the island. Stanley tries to focus, but the tension is increasing again. The vibration through the walls returns, stronger this time and more synchronized. He places his hand against the surface and immediately feels the structured rhythm of multiple systems operating in coordination. This is no longer random activation, it is phased escalation. He realizes the VX system is moving closer to full operational readiness. Each phase brings it closer to a point where external intervention becomes significantly more difficult. Mason signals forward movement again, but more cautiously now. As they advance, the corridor opens slightly into a broader access lane with multiple branching points. Some paths are sealed with reinforced barriers, while others appear to lead toward higher level control infrastructure. Mason studies the layout and identifies a likely direction based on structural density and access design. He concludes that the most critical systems are likely located in a centralized command and coordination node further inside the facility. Suddenly, a faint sound echoes through the corridor, metallic footsteps, slow and deliberate. Both men immediately stop. The sound is not distant anymore. It is within the same structural network. Mason gestures for silence and moves carefully toward the edge of the corridor to observe. Stanley remains behind, struggling to control his breathing. The footsteps stop briefly, then resume in a different direction, suggesting active patrol movement within the maintenance network. Mason returns quietly and confirms that internal security units are now operating in the deeper sections of the facility. This changes the situation significantly. It means the core systems are not only active but actively protected by dedicated personnel. The deeper they go, the more resistance they will encounter. Stanley understands the implication immediately. They are no longer moving through an abandoned or hidden system. They are inside a fully operational military controlled infrastructure. As they proceed further, the environment begins to shift again. The corridor transitions into a more structured industrial passageway with clearer segmentation and reinforced access gates. The lighting becomes more consistent and the vibration through the walls intensifies into a steady operational pulse. Stanley begins to notice that multiple system layers are now synchronized, indicating that the VX deployment infrastructure is approaching its final readiness stage. He voices his concern to Mason, explaining that once systems reach this level of synchronization, any further activation could lock the entire structure into a pre-launch state. At that point, stopping the system would require direct intervention at the core control interface. Mason listens carefully, absorbing the tactical implication. His focus shifts entirely toward identifying the central control node that governs the system's operational cycle. Above them, the SEAL teams make another attempt to stabilize their positions, but resistance remains strong and coordinated. Hummel's forces continue to maintain structured defensive pressure, controlling movement patterns and limiting tactical flexibility. The island remains firmly under partial internal control, even as external forces attempt to regain access. In Washington, urgency reaches critical levels as officials recognize that the VX system is now fully capable of entering deployment within a very short time frame. Back underground, Stanley and Mason finally reach a heavily reinforced threshold at the end of the corridor. The structure here is different, denser, more secure, and clearly designed to restrict access to only high-level operational areas. Mason stops and studies the interface carefully. This is not just another passageway. It is a controlled entry point to a central system zone. Stanley looks at it, then at Mason. Neither of them speaks for a moment. The realization settles in between them. Whatever lies beyond this point is not just part of the system. It is the system's command layer, and stepping through it means moving directly into the center of the most dangerous weapons facility ever constructed beneath Alcatraz. Stanley Goodspeed and John Mason stand in front of the heavily reinforced threshold deep within Alcatraz, where the maintenance corridors finally converge into what appears to be a central operational control zone. The structure here is unlike anything they have seen so far. Thicker walls, layered steel reinforcements, biometric locking systems, and encrypted military-grade access panels. Every element of the design suggests one clear purpose. This is not a storage area or a transit corridor. This is the command interface of the entire VX deployment system. Stanley's breathing is controlled but tense. His scientific understanding has taken him as far as it can, but what lies ahead is no longer just chemistry or engineering. It is military infrastructure integrated with automated weapons deployment. He realizes that everything they have seen so far was only supporting architecture. The true control mechanism is still ahead of them, behind this final barrier. Mason stands beside him, silent and focused, scanning the structure with tactical awareness. For him, this is the moment where all fragmented systems must converge into a single control point. If there is a way to stop this operation, it will be here. Above ground, Alcatraz remains in a state of controlled collapse. The Navy SEAL teams are still engaged in fragmented operations across multiple sectors, but their ability to coordinate has been severely compromised. Hummel's forces continue to dominate key structural zones using the island's architecture to dictate engagement flow. Corridors are sealed off, access points are controlled, and movement is restricted into predictable patterns. What was once a covert military insertion has fully transformed into a containment battlefield inside enemy-controlled territory. Casualties increase, communication weakens, and operational control becomes increasingly unstable. Inside the command center, General Francis Hummel watches the unfolding situation with measured calm. His strategy is still intact, but he is now fully aware that the VX system has moved beyond a simple bargaining tool. It has become a critical escalation threshold. His intent was never mass destruction, it was leverage through controlled pressure. However, he also understands that systems of this magnitude cannot be left partially active indefinitely. At some point, control must either be reasserted or released, and that decision now carries irreversible consequences. Back underground, Stanley carefully begins analyzing the control interface in front of them. The system is layered with multiple authentication protocols, including electronic verification, structural access sequencing, and likely internal command authorization from within the chamber system. He realizes that this is not a simple terminal. It is a centralized command node that governs the entire VX deployment infrastructure. If activated, it could initiate or abort full system readiness across the island. Mason studies the surrounding environment carefully. His focus is no longer just on the door, but on the structural layout around it. He identifies potential security blind spots and secondary access routes, suggesting that even this control zone may have alternative entry or override systems. But before they can act further, a low mechanical vibration spreads through the walls again, stronger than before. It is no longer isolated, it is synchronized across multiple systems. Stanley immediately recognized the pattern. The VX system has reached its final pre-deployment phase. The entire infrastructure is now fully synchronized and awaiting final authorization input. Once that input is triggered, the system will transition from readiness to active deployment capability in a matter of moments. His voice tightens as he explains the implication. At this stage, even small delays or missteps could trigger irreversible activation sequences. Suddenly, a faint but distinct sound echoes through the corridor behind them. Metallic footsteps, controlled and deliberate. Mason reacts instantly, signaling silence and moving to cover. Stanley freezes, realizing that internal security units have now reached the same level of the facility. This confirms that the command zone is actively protected and monitored. The deeper they go, the tighter the security becomes. Mason carefully observes the corridor and confirms that movement patterns suggest coordinated patrol behavior. These are not scattered defenders. They are structured units assigned specifically to protect critical infrastructure. The situation has now escalated beyond infiltration. It has become a direct penetration of a fortified command system. Stanley looks at the control interface again, realizing that they are running out of time. The VX system is not waiting for them. It is progressing independently through its activation sequence. Every second brings it closer to deployment readiness. He understands that the only way to stop it is to either interrupt the system at the core level or override the command authorization before final lock-in. Mason makes a decision. They must enter the control zone. Stanley hesitates for a brief moment, fully aware that stepping through this threshold means entering the most dangerous part of the entire operation. But there is no alternative. If they do nothing, the system will complete its cycle. They move forward. The reinforced barrier begins to disengage under partial access override from Stanley's earlier modifications combined with Mason's forced mechanical adjustment. The locking system releases in stages, each one echoing through the corridor like a countdown. The final seal disengages and the massive door begins to open slowly, revealing the central command chamber. Inside, the scale of the system becomes fully visible. Massive control consoles line the chamber, connected to the entire VX deployment infrastructure. Status indicators show synchronized readiness across all rocket units. Structural mapping displays Alcatraz as a fully integrated launch environment. Automated systems are actively monitoring, calibrating, and maintaining deployment readiness. Stanley steps inside first, overwhelmed by the realization that this is not just a control room, it is the brain of the entire weapon system. Mason follows closely, scanning for security presence and tactical vulnerabilities. But both men understand the same truth instantly. This is the final point of control. And if they cannot stop the system here, San Francisco will not get another chance.